U.S. GDP shrank by 0.9% between April and June when factoring in inflation, 0.2, showing the economy shrank 2 quarters in a row, and some say that means a recession. Yahoo Finance's editor-in-chief, Andy Serwer, joining us now with a deeper dive here. Hello, Andy. You say there is a bigger question here. What's that?
Yeah, Dave. I mean, the bigger question is about GDP itself. Is the metric itself flawed? And let's just start off and say that this is a heretical question to ask because we base so much on measuring GDP in our country. And there's all manner of economists, bankers, government officials, prognosticators. Dave Briggs is dedicated on measuring GDP and then, of course, fixing it. That's be the bankers and the economists. And, you know, it all sort of benefits them. But there's a lot to be said in arguing that GDP is not all that it doesn't quite measure the right things, which is to say quality of life, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And Andy, different countries do put different things into their GDP, but do any countries actually not use GDP?
You know, it's interesting because there are a few countries that have moved away and or maybe are moving away and accentuate it less, to your original point. But, you know, you can look at Bhutan, this Asian landlocked nation. In 1971, they moved away from GDP completely and moved to a happiness index. It's called the Gross National Happiness Index. And, you know, they've made some progress with that. Of course, it looks at spiritual, physical, social, environmental health. And, you know, it's a small country and all that. Number two, New Zealand, a couple years ago, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern started something which was a well-being a budget. And that is also looking at sustainability and pointing government spending towards things that GDP doesn't measure. For instance, you know, living standards, who's left out, who's not left out. And then I would argue finally that some traditional European economies like, say, France, Spain, and Italy, perhaps inadvertently have not been focusing on GDP for centuries by funding the arts and education more than the United States does. And, you know, the same economists who say, oh, New Zealand and Bhutan, those are off, you know, tiny little countries, or, oh, France, they're saying that France and Spain and Italy aren't very good economies. Well, I would say all these places, you know, are pretty nice places to live. So there is that point.
And all this in consideration, we point to GDP so often. It's a very trusted metric by economists. So are we looking at it, I guess, through the right lens, or is there a little bit more here?
Yeah, Shauna, you know, it's interesting. I mean, we just take it for granted, like, oh, GDP, you know, this is this hallowed, infallible metric. But in fact, it's neither. I mean, first of all, we didn't use GDP in the United States until 1991. I'm old enough to remember GNP. I mean, it's still around there, gross national product. And we shifted to GDP back in 1991 to match the rest of the world. So we have changed, number one. Number two, I don't know if you guys are familiar with leprechaun economics. This is something that happened to Ireland only about 5 or 6 years ago. And, you know, Ireland is a huge tax shelter. And the entire country was so gamed by multinationals using this country and economy as a massive tax shelter, in particular Apple, it seems, according to investigations, that, for instance, in 2015, their economy grew, the Irish economy grew, according to GDP, by 26.3%, and it was actually revised to over 30%. So in 2017, Ireland scrapped GDP and replaced it with modified GNI, or gross national income. So it shows that GDP can be gamed or at least warped and distorted. Again, pointing to the fact that it's not infallible, and so that there are other indexes, there's other ways of thinking. And, you know, it might be to our advantage ultimately to consider those.
Sounds like it might be. Maybe this is the time to do so. Andy Serwer, Yahoo Finance editor-in-chief, thanks so much. And, of course, you can read Andy's column on this on yahoofinance.com this weekend.